Number 10. Josephoartigasia, the rodent that outbid a saber-tooth. In 2008, scientists described a single fossilized skull pulled from the sea cliffs of Cayú Beach in Uruguay, and it broke a record that still stands. The skull was over half a meter long, the size of a cow's, and it belonged to Josephoartigasia monesi, the largest rodent that has ever lived.
Picture a guinea pig's body plan inflated to the dimensions of a buffalo.
Around 3 meters long, standing as tall as a person at the shoulder, and weighing somewhere between half a ton and a full ton. This animal lived in South America roughly 3 million years ago, and it was a rodent in the way a battleship is a boat. The skull is where it gets frightening. In 2015, a team led by Philip Cox at the University of York took that skull, ran it through a CT scanner, built a virtual model, and tested it with the same engineering software used to stress test bridges and aircraft. The result? Josephoartigasia could bite with a force of around 1,400 newtons at its front teeth, which is in the same range as a modern tiger. At the back teeth, the force climbed toward 5,000 newtons, into territory that rivals a crocodile. And the incisors themselves, those huge curved front teeth, were strong enough to take nearly 3 times the animal's own bite force without breaking. That last detail is the key to what this creature actually was. Teeth built to survive forces far beyond what biting requires are not just for eating. The researchers concluded that Josephoartigasia used its incisors the way an elephant uses its tusks, to dig for food, to fight, and above all, to defend itself. And it needed to, because it shared its world with scimitar-toothed cats, sparacidonts, and terror birds 3 meters tall. Here is the part that should reset your sense of who was dangerous in that landscape.
The bite of this giant rodent was stronger than the bite estimated for the saber-toothed predators hunting alongside it. A cat that tried to take down an adult Josephoartigasia was walking into a set of tiger-strength jaws and a pair of tusk-like incisors swung by a ton of muscle. There is one thing this animal never did, and it is worth saying plainly now because it sets up the whole list. It never killed a human, because it never met one. Josephoartigasia vanished around 2 million years before the first people ever set foot in South America. Its weapons were forged in a war with predators, not with us. That is the thread running through much of what follows. These animals were not built to fight humans. They were built to survive a world far more dangerous than ours, and the same equipment that let them stand up to a saber-tooth would go through a person without slowing down. To picture the world this animal ruled, you have to fill it with nightmares.
Josephoartigasia shared its estuary with terror birds 3 meters tall, with ground sloths, and with Thylacis milis, a saber-toothed hunter built on the marsupial side of the family tree. In a cast like that, you would expect the giant rodent to be the nervous prey animal. The bite force study flips that assumption on its head. With jaws that outmuscled the local saber-tooths and incisors that could double as crowbars, an adult Josephoartigasia was less a victim than a fortress that happened to eat plants. It is worth admitting how thin the evidence is, because that thinness is part of the story. Almost everything we know about this creature comes from that one nearly complete skull, found in the cliffs of Uruguay and named in honor of the national hero José Artigas. Even its weight is debated, with serious estimates ranging from under 500 kilograms to a full ton, and the lower jaw used in the bite model had to be reconstructed from a smaller relative.
The headline holds up regardless. The biggest rodent that ever gnawed was armed like a big cat. The next animal on this list did share its world with people, and it may have walked straight out of the swamp and into legend. Number 9. Diprotodon, the giant that became a monster myth. In the dry bed of Lake Calibana in South Australia lies a graveyard. Buried in the cracked clay are dozens of complete skeletons of the largest marsupial that has ever existed. Animals that wandered onto the drying lake, sank into the mud, and stayed there for tens of thousands of years. This is Diprotodon, and the closest living thing to it is a wombat, which tells you nothing useful because Diprotodon stood 2 meters tall at the shoulder, stretched 3 meters from nose to tail, and weighed up to 2,800 kilograms. It was a wombat the size of a hippopotamus. It was also, in its own quiet way, an impressive animal.
Chemical signatures locked in its teeth show that Diprotodon herds migrated more than 200 kilometers a year, following the seasons across the continent, making it the only marsupial ever known to undertake true seasonal migration. It had powerful jaws built to grind through the toughest, driest vegetation Australia could offer, and it traveled in family groups. A nearly 3-ton herbivore moving in herds is not an animal anything sane chooses to provoke. Even the marsupial lion, the fearsome Thylacoleo that lived alongside it, would have thought hard about an adult. What makes Diprotodon different from the giant rodent we just met is that this one looked humans in the eye. People reached Australia somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years ago, and Diprotodon survived until at least 40,000 years ago, which means humans and these giants shared the continent for thousands of years. Butchered bones have turned up at early human sites. The debate over what finished the megafauna off, human hunting, a drying climate, or both together, is still genuinely open, but the timing is hard to ignore. Across Australia, the giants faded out within a window of human arrival. Diprotodon holds a small place in scientific history too. It was the first fossil mammal ever named from Australia, described by the anatomist Richard Owen in 1838 from bones shipped back to England at a time when Europe was only beginning to grasp how alien Australia's lost wildlife had been. And it did not live in a world without danger. Sharing the continent with it was Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, a pound-for-pound ferocious predator with bolt-cutter teeth and a huge thumb claw. Even for a hunter like that, a healthy adult Diprotodon, 3 tons of armored bulk moving in a herd, was a target to be approached with extreme caution, if at all. The giant's defense was not speed or claws. It was simply being too large and too strong to be worth the risk. And then there is the legend. When European settlers arrived and began turning up enormous fossil bones, they recorded Aboriginal people identifying those bones as belonging to the bunyip, the bellowing water monster of countless Australian stories. Since the 1800s, scholars have wondered whether the bunyip myth is in part a cultural memory of real megafauna like Diprotodon, passed down across hundreds of generations. To be clear, this idea is unconfirmed and probably unprovable, and the bunyip legend drew on many sources. But the possibility is striking. The largest marsupial in history may not have vanished completely. It may have walked on, transformed, in the oldest continuous storytelling tradition on Earth. The name itself tells you about its strangest weapon. Diprotodon means 2 forward teeth, a reference to the pair of large, forward-jutting incisors at the front of its lower jaw, rodent-like chisels set in the skull of a 3-ton animal. Behind them sat broad grinding molars for pulping the saltbush and dry shrubs of the Australian interior. It carried the largest pouch of any animal that has ever lived, big enough for a calf the size of a sheep, and it raised its young in family herds that crossed the continent with the seasons. The Lake Calabana graveyard hints at how these giants often died even without a predator. Whole herds appear to have ventured onto the deceptive crust of the drying salt lake in search of water, only for the heaviest animals to break through and become stuck fast in the mud beneath, sinking and starving where they stood. It is a grim image, hundreds of the largest marsupials in history trapped in a lake bed, but it is also a gift because it preserved them complete.
What it does not preserve is a clean answer to the human question. Direct evidence of people interacting with living Diprotodon is genuinely sparse, which is exactly why the bunyip idea remains a tantalizing maybe rather than a fact. The next plant eater traded brute bulk for something far stranger. It had the body of a horse and the claws of a gorilla. Number 8. Chalicotherium, the horse with a gorilla's hands. When the first fossils of this animal came out of the ground, they caused an argument because the bones did not seem to belong together. There were teeth that clearly came from a large grazing animal, a relative of horses and rhinos. And there were enormous curved claws that looked like they belonged on a predator or a giant ground sloth. For a while, some researchers assumed they were looking at two different animals. They were not. They were looking at Chalicotherium, one of the strangest body plans the age of mammals ever produced.
Chalicotherium lived across long stretches of the Miocene, tens of millions of years ago, and it was built like a contradiction. Its hind legs were short, its front legs long and powerful, ending in hands tipped with massive hooked claws. It could not gallop like a horse. Instead, it likely sat back on its haunches and reached up into the trees, hooking branches with those claws and dragging the foliage down to its mouth, a feeding style we see today in animals as different as gorillas and the long-vanished ground sloths. To protect the claws from wearing down, it probably walked on its knuckles. Imagine a leaf-eating animal the size of a large horse, knuckle-walking through a Miocene forest, then rearing up to pull a tree apart with its bare hands. Those claws were tools for stripping vegetation. But a tool that can tear a branch from a trunk does not care whether it meets wood or flesh. A full-grown Chalicotherium, rearing up to its considerable height and swinging a clawed forelimb, was carrying defensive weapons that any big cat of its era would have respected. It did not need to chase anything. It only needed to make one swing count. Like the giant rodent, this animal belongs on the list for what it was capable of, not for any human it ever harmed, because it died out millions of years before our species existed. Its claws never met a person. But they tell the same story the rest of this countdown keeps telling. The plant eaters of the deep past were armed to the teeth, sometimes literally, because the alternative was being eaten. Chalicotherium was not a one-off freak either. It belonged to a whole family of clawed, leaf-eating oddities, the Chalicotheres, that spread across Asia, Africa, Europe, and North America over tens of millions of years, including a North American cousin called Meropus. They were never common. A heavy browser that reaches up to strip the high branches does not need a dense population to make a living. But they persisted for an astonishingly long time. A quiet, successful experiment in being a hoofed mammal that gave up hooves on its hands in favor of claws. The knuckle walking is the detail that makes people do a double take, because it is the same solution a gorilla arrived at by a completely separate evolutionary road for a completely different reason. The gorilla knuckle walks to support its weight. Chalicotherium did it to keep from blunting the very claws it used to feed and defend itself. Convergence like that is evolution showing its hand. The same problem solved twice in two animals separated by tens of millions of years. And the answer in both cases produced a powerful, knuckle-walking herbivore that you would be unwise to startle. The next herbivore did not bother with claws or a bite.
It carried a battering ram on its face, and it came at you in a herd. Number 7. EMBOLOTHERIUM, the ram-nosed wall of muscle. Around 35 million years ago, the plains of what is now Mongolia were home to a giant. EMBOLOTHERIUM was a brontothere, part of a family of huge rhinoceros-like mammals that were not actually rhinos at all, and it stood as tall as a large elephant. Its defining feature rose straight off the front of its skull, an enormous bony plate, a great blunt ram pointing up and forward from where you would expect a nose. In the old reconstructions, This structure made EMBOLOTHERIUM look like a living battering ram, an animal that settled disputes and fended off predators by charging headfirst into them. The truth is a little more subtle and more interesting. When paleontologists looked closely at that bony ram, they found it was hollow, connected to the nasal passages. That has led many to suspect it was not primarily a weapon at all, but a resonating chamber, a built-in trumpet for producing loud, deep calls to signal across the herd or intimidate rivals. So the fearsome ram may have been as much about sound as about force. But that distinction would have offered little comfort to anything in its path, because the animal behind the ram was a multi-ton giant that moved in groups. Whether the structure was for bellowing or for bludgeoning, the creature carrying it could flatten almost anything by simply walking forward with intent. And that is the real danger of an animal like EMBOLOTHERIUM. You do not need claws or fangs when you weigh several tons and travel in a herd. A single startled individual is a catastrophe of momentum. A herd of them stampeding is a force closer to a landslide than to anything you would call an animal attack. The predators of the late Eocene, the early carnivorous mammals of Asia, survived by picking off the young, the old, and the sick, and by staying very far away from a healthy adult. These animals are famous partly because of where they were found. EMBOLOTHERIUM skulls came out of the Gobi Desert during the legendary expeditions of the 1920s. The same Central Asian digs, led by Roy Chapman Andrews, that first revealed nests of dinosaur eggs to the world. Out of that red rock came the remains of a whole lost world of giant Eocene mammals. And the ram-nosed Brontothere was among its strangest stars. EMBOLOTHERIUM was also part of a doomed dynasty. The Brontotheres as a group, including even larger North American relatives, were browsers that depended on soft forest leaves. And they were running out of time.
As the climate cooled toward the end of the Eocene and tough, gritty grasses began replacing the lush forests, these giants had the wrong teeth for the new menu, and the entire family died out, ram noses and all. It is a recurring fate on this list. Enormous, superbly armed plant eaters brought down not by any predator, but by a quiet shift in what the land would grow. This is another giant that never laid eyes on a human. EMBOLOTHERIUM was gone tens of millions of years before the first members of our family climbed down from the trees. Its ram, its bulk, its herd, all of it evolved in a world with no people in it at all. Which makes the next entry a turning point, because the next animal is the first on this list that humans genuinely knew, hunted, and in the end, destroyed. Number 6, the giant moa, the bird we turned the tables on. New Zealand had no native land mammals to speak of, and into that empty stage stepped the birds. The largest of them was the South Island giant moa, and it was the tallest bird that has ever lived. Females, the bigger sex, could reach 3.6 meters when they stretched their long necks upward, and weigh around 230 kilograms. For comparison, the largest bird alive today, the ostrich, tops out under 3 meters. The moa was a feathered giant, flightless, with no wings at all, a powerful body and legs like tree trunks. Those legs are the weapon. The moa's closest living relatives and ecological echoes, birds like the ostrich and the cassowary, can deliver kicks powerful enough to break bones and kill. A cornered giant moa, lashing out with a leg that drove 200 kilograms behind a clawed foot, was not a gentle creature you would want to crowd. It could absolutely have killed a person who got too close.
But here the list turns over on itself, because the giant moa is the one animal so far where we know exactly how the contest between human and herbivore ended, and the herbivore lost. When Polynesian settlers, the ancestors of the Maori, reached New Zealand around the year 1300, They found 9 species of moa that had never seen a land predator like a human. Within roughly 150 years, every single species was gone, hunted out and burned out of its forests. This was not a slow decline over ice ages. It was one of the fastest large animal extinctions ever recorded, and we were the cause. The deadliest predator the moa ever faced walked on 2 legs and carried fire. The moa was strange even by the standards of giant birds. It is the only known bird with no wings at all, not even the tiny vestigial stubs that ostriches and emus keep. Evolution erased the forelimbs completely.
To grind the tough leaves and twigs it ate, it swallowed stones, carrying kilograms of smooth gizzard pebbles in its gut like a built-in mill. And when scientists finally recovered moa DNA, it delivered a shock. The giant's closest living relative is not the neighboring kiwi, nor the Australian emu, but the tinamou, a chicken-sized bird that still flies through the forests of South America. The tallest bird that ever lived was a cousin of one that fits in your 2 hands. The speed of the moa's fall is what still stuns researchers. Studies of the timing suggest that all 9 species may have collapsed within roughly a century of human arrival, possibly less, one of the fastest megafaunal extinctions anywhere on record. A breeding slow, fearless, flightless giant simply could not absorb the pressure of hunting and forest burning from a brand new predator. And now, 600 years later, there is a new twist that belongs in this story. In 2025, the company Colossal Biosciences announced a project in partnership with the Nai Tahu people, the Canterbury Museum, and the filmmaker Peter Jackson to attempt to bring the giant moa back. By May of 2026, they were reporting a genuine technical breakthrough, a transparent artificial egg from which they had already hatched 26 chickens, designed eventually to incubate something far larger. They aim to complete the first moa genomes in the summer of 2026, reading the bird's DNA from old bones and comparing it to its closest living relative, a small South American bird called the tinamou. Most scientists caution that the result, if it ever walks, will be a genetically engineered proxy rather than a true MOA, and many Maori have raised deep objections. The tallest bird that ever lived was killed by humans in a century and a half. Whether humans can or should undo that is now a live and very loud argument. Before humans arrived, the moa did have one natural enemy, and it was as spectacular as the moa itself. Haast's eagle was the largest eagle that has ever lived, a predator weighing up to 15 kilograms with talons the size of a tiger's claws, and it hunted the giant moa by striking from above at terrible speed and driving those talons into the bird's pelvis and skull. An eagle that could kill a 200-kilogram moa was more than capable of killing a human being. And Maori oral tradition preserves the memory of a monstrous bird, the poakai, that snatched people from the ground. When the moa were hunted out, Haast's eagle lost its only prey large enough to sustain it, and the greatest eagle in history followed its food into extinction. The moa's biology made it terribly vulnerable to a new kind of hunter. These birds bred slowly, laid few eggs, and had spent millions of years with no ground predator to fear, so they had no instinct to flee from a small, 2-legged newcomer. To the first settlers, a flightless 3-meter bird that did not run away was simply the largest, easiest meal in the country. By the time the moa learned to be afraid, there were almost none of them left, and the next bird was even more terrifying to look at. For more than 100 years, almost everyone was wrong about what it actually ate. Number 5. GASTORNIS, the terror bird that wasn't. For most of the 20th century, this animal had a fearsome reputation. GASTORNIS, also known by the name Diatrema, was a flightless bird standing up to 2 meters tall, with a head the size of a horse's and a massive, deep, powerful beak. It lived in the warm forests of the Paleocene and Eocene, in the strange world just after the dinosaurs died, when mammals were still small. And so the story wrote itself. Here was a giant killer bird, the new top predator, chasing down the little dawn horses of the ancient forest and crushing their skulls in that enormous beak.
Documentaries built dramatic scenes around it. It was the monster of its age. There was just one problem. It was almost certainly a vegetarian. Over the last decade or so, several independent lines of evidence have demolished the predator image. When researchers analyzed the calcium isotopes locked in GASTORNIS bones in 2014, the chemical signature came back matching herbivores, the plant eaters, not the meat eaters. Fossil footprints attributed to these birds show no sign of the hooked talons a predator uses to pin prey. And the beak itself, for all its size, lacks the hooked tip that meat-eating birds rely on to tear flesh. The modern consensus is that GASTORNIS used that monstrous beak to crack open hard seeds, nuts, and tough vegetation, not skulls. So why is a gentle seed cracker on a list of deadly animals? Because of that beak. The bite force packed into it was far greater than anything eating plants actually requires, which is part of what fooled scientists for so long. A bird with a head the size of a horse's and a beak strong enough to split nuts like a nutcracker could close that beak on a limb or a skull with appalling power. It did not hunt, but anything that threatened it or threatened its nest would have met a defensive blow from one of the most powerful beaks evolution has ever built. GASTORNIS is a double correction then. It was never the predator we imagined, and it never met a human, having died out tens of millions of years before our species appeared. It is the clearest case on this list of how easily we mistake a heavily armed plant eater for a killer. The lesson keeps repeating. In the ancient world, being a vegetarian and being dangerous were never opposites. Part of the confusion came from a case of mistaken identity that lasted over a century. Half a world away, in South America, there really were giant flightless killer birds, the Forus racids, the true terror birds, with hooked beaks and the speed to run down prey. GASTORNIS looked superficially like them, and so it inherited their fearsome reputation by association, despite belonging to a completely different branch of the bird family tree and living on different continents. One group were genuine apex predators. The other, it turns out, were peaceful giants cracking seeds in the forest. They just happened to look alike enough to fool generations of artists. The evidence for the gentle interpretation keeps accumulating. In 2009, a landslide in Washington state exposed a set of fossil footprints attributed to one of these birds, and the tracks showed flat, blunt toes with no trace of the curved killing talons a predator would carry. Combined with the chemistry of the bones and the shape of the beak, the case is now strong enough that the old image of GASTORNIS spearing little horses survives mainly in reruns of old documentaries. The real animal was a 2-meter, 200-kilogram nutcracker, which is harmless right up until the moment you threaten it. From here, the list crosses into South America in the last ice age, and into the company of the first humans ever to set foot there, starting with an animal that genuinely shared their land. Number 4. TOXODON. Darwin's strange and dangerous beast. In 1832, a young naturalist named Charles Darwin, traveling through South America on the Beagle, paid a few shillings for a strange and broken skull. He had no idea what it belonged to. Later, he would write that the animal was perhaps one of the strangest ever discovered, and he was not exaggerating. The skull belonged to Toxodon, a member of a wholly extinct group of South American mammals that evolved in isolation on that island continent into shapes found nowhere else on Earth. Toxodon looked like an evolutionary committee built a hippopotamus out of rhinoceros and rodent parts. It was a heavy-set, barrel-bodied grazer, weighing well over a ton, with a broad muzzle, ever-growing teeth, and a body built low and powerful. It probably spent its time near water and on open grassland, cropping vegetation in enormous quantities. In raw build, it was the rough equivalent of a modern rhino. And that comparison matters because a rhinoceros is one of the most dangerous large herbivores alive today, an animal that kills people who get too close, not by hunting them, but by sheer mass, speed, and short temper.
It was Richard Owen, the same anatomist who would later coin the word dinosaur, who formally named the creature in 1837, calling it TOXODON, meaning bowtooth, for the long, curved, ever-growing teeth set in its jaws. Those teeth grew throughout the animal's life to keep pace with a lifetime of grinding, abrasive vegetation, the mark of a dedicated, heavy-duty grazer. The broader picture of first contact in the Americas is now coming into sharp focus. At sites like Taima Taima in Venezuela, the bones of Ice Age giants have been found with stone spear points lodged among them, hard physical proof that the first Americans hunted animals on this scale. Toxodon lived and died in exactly that world of newly arrived, spear-carrying humans, which is what moves it from a creature that could theoretically have hurt a person to one that shared its swamps with people who were actively trying to kill it. What lifts Toxodon onto this list is that it did not live in some human-free deep past. It survived into the last ice age and overlapped with the first people to reach the Americas, somewhere around 12 to 13,000 years ago. At more than one ancient kill site in South America, the bones of giant beasts are found together with the stone weapons of early hunters, and Toxodon was among the megafauna those first Americans encountered and hunted. Picture that confrontation honestly. A band of humans armed with stone-tipped spears, closing in on a short-tempered 1.5-ton animal with the temperament of a rhino. The hunters held the long-term advantage, but any individual hunt could go wrong in a heartbeat, and a cornered Toxodon turning on its attackers would have been lethal. Toxodon belonged to an entire lost order of mammals called the nodoungulates, hoofed animals that evolved in splendid isolation while South America was an island continent, cut off from the rest of the world for tens of millions of years.
When the land bridge of Panama finally rose and connected the Americas, northern animals poured south and southern animals north, in the great reshuffling biologists call the Great American Biotic Interchange. Toxodon was one of the natives that held on through that upheaval, right up until the end of the last ice age. Its end is where the human story sharpens. At Ice Age kill sites across South America, the bones of giant mammals lie alongside the stone weapons of the first Americans, and at several of them, the megafauna show the unmistakable marks of butchery. Toxodon was part of that world, a slow, heavy, water-loving grazer hunted by small bands of newly arrived humans. Set the scene in your mind. A rhino-sized animal with a short fuse, ringed by hunters with spears, with no way out except through them. The humans usually won in the long run, but a 1.5-ton animal does not lose quietly, and more than one of those hunts must have ended with a man dead in the mud.
We do not have a fossil of a Toxodon goring a hunter. That specific moment is not something the rock preserves. What we have is the overlap, the kill sites, and the simple physics of a heavy, powerful animal that did not want to die. It shared the land with the first Americans, and on a bad day, it could have killed them. The next animal removed even that uncertainty, because it came to the same fight already wearing armor and carrying a club. Number 3, the GLYPTODONT, a living tank with a war club. If you wanted to design an animal that no predator could touch, you might end up with something very close to a GLYPTODONT. These were giant relatives of armadillos, and the largest of them were the size of a small car, weighing around 1.5 tons. The entire top half of the animal was sealed inside a domed shell of fused bony plates, hundreds of them locked together into a single rigid carapace. The head had its own bony cap, and the tail was sheathed in armored rings. A glyptodont walking across the Ice Age plains of South America was, for all practical purposes, a tank with legs. Armor alone would have been enough to earn a place here, but one group of glyptodonts, the Dodicurines, went further and grew a weapon. The tail of Doedicurus ended in a massive club, a heavy bony tube that in life was tipped with large keratin spikes, the whole structure weighing in the tens of kilograms. This was not decoration. Engineers who modeled the tail found it could be swung with tremendous speed and force, and the fossil shells of glyptodonts sometimes carry damage, dents, and fractures that match exactly the kind of blow such a club would deliver. In other words, these animals use their tail maces on each other in heavy combat, hard enough to crack each other's armor. Now, imagine that weapon turned on a person. A spiked club, swung by a 1.5-ton animal with enough force to fracture bone armor, would not merely injure a human being. It would end them instantly. And this is another animal that genuinely shared the world with the first Americans. There is even evidence that early people made use of glyptodonts after death, with some sites suggesting humans sheltered beneath the empty domed shells, using them as ready-made huts. So the relationship ran both ways. Humans hunted glyptodonts and used their shells, and a cornered, club-tailed glyptodont was perfectly capable of killing the hunters who came for it. The club evolved for duels between rivals, not for war with people. But a weapon that can shatter another tank's armor does not need any modification to kill a soft, two-legged ape. For a long time, nobody was sure what a glyptodont even was, but ancient DNA has now settled it. These armored giants were true armadillos, just inflated to monstrous size and sealed inside a single rigid dome, instead of the flexible bands a modern armadillo wears. The shell of a big glyptodont was built from over 1,000 bony tiles fused into one piece, a structure so tough and so roomy that, after the animal died, early humans in South America are thought to have tipped the empty shells over and sheltered inside them, using a dead tank as a house. The club deserves a closer look because it was a genuine piece of biological engineering. In Doedicurus, the tail was encased in rigid rings and tipped with a heavy knob that bore large, sharp spikes of keratin in life. Studies of how the tail could move show it was capable of being swung in a fast, powerful arc, and the dented, healed-over fractures found on some glyptodont shells line up disturbingly well with the size and force of those clubs. The animals were hitting each other hard enough to crack bone armor and survive it. A weapon refined over millions of years to defeat the toughest shield in the animal kingdom would treat a human ribcage as an afterthought. But the final Ice Age giant had no armor and no club. Its danger was hidden in the way it was built to move. Number 2. MACRAUCHENIA, the shapeshifter with the impossible legs. MACRAUCHENIA is another of the creatures that baffled Darwin, and it has never entirely stopped baffling scientists. The body was roughly that of a large camel or a heavy llama, standing perhaps 3 meters long and weighing around a ton. The neck was long, and the skull had a feature that has fueled arguments for nearly 2 centuries. The nostril opening sat high up, almost between the eyes, which suggests the animal may have had a short trunk, or at least a large, flexible, moose-like nose. It was so strange, so unlike anything alive, that it took ancient DNA, finally recovered in 2017, to even sort out where it sat on the tree of life, as a distant relative of horses and rhinos. For our purposes, the interesting part is lower down, in the legs. MACRAUCHENIA had remarkably flexible limbs and ankle joints, built in a way that let it plant a foot and change direction at speed, pivoting almost like a modern impala. In a landscape patrolled by Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, and other ambush predators, that agility was its survival strategy. It could not outmuscle a saber-tooth, so it evolved to outmaneuver one, to be the animal that twisted away at the last instant and left the predator clutching empty air. That same build is what makes it dangerous to anything trying to corner it. An animal weighing a ton that can pivot, kick, and bolt in an unexpected direction is hard to predict and hard to trap. A kick from a limb built for that kind of explosive movement carries enormous force. And like the last two animals, MACRAUCHENIA lived into the late Ice Age and shared its world with the first people to spread across South America. Those early hunters would have known it as a real and present animal, one they pursued for its meat, and one that could shatter a leg or a skull with a single panicked kick before vanishing into the brush. Sorting out what MACRAUCHENIA even was took nearly 2 centuries and a breakthrough in technology. Darwin and the anatomist Richard Owen puzzled over its bones in the 1800s and could not place it. It looked like pieces of several familiar animals stitched together, and none of them quite right. The answer only came in 2017, when scientists managed to recover ancient genetic material from the bones and showed that MACRAUCHENIA and its kin, the Lidopterns, were distant relatives of horses, rhinos, and tapirs, a southern branch that had split off more than 60 million years earlier and gone its own strange way. The famous trunk is still argued over. The high position of the nasal opening on the skull suggested to early researchers that the animal had a tapir-like proboscis, but more recent work has questioned this, pointing out that retracted nostrils can serve other purposes, from filtering dust to enhancing smell. What is not in doubt is the build of the legs. The bones of the lower limb and ankle are shaped for flexibility and quick changes of direction, the hallmark of an animal whose survival depended on dodging, and an animal that can pivot a ton of body weight in an instant can also drive a kick into a pursuer with bone-breaking force. It is the last of the strange Ice Age giants on this list. The animal at number 1 is stranger still, not because of a club or a kick or a ram, but because of how closely it resembled us, and how directly it stood face to face with our own ancestors. Number 1. Gigantopithecus, the giant ape that met our ancestors.
In 1935, a scientist named Ralph von Koenigswald walked into an apothecary in Hong Kong, where ground-up fossils were sold as traditional medicine under the name dragon bones, and spotted an enormous primate molar for sale. It was far too big to belong to any known ape. That single tooth was the first clue to the existence of Gigantopithecus, the largest primate that has ever lived. We still know it almost entirely from teeth, around 2,000 of them, and a handful of jawbones. But from those fragments, the picture is staggering. Standing upright, Gigantopithecus may have reached 3 meters tall and weighed somewhere between 200 and 300 kilograms, the rough proportions of a polar bear in the body of an ape. Despite that size, it was a vegetarian.
Analysis of its teeth points to a diet of fruit and tough, fibrous plants, and it likely depended heavily on the forests of southern China and Southeast Asia, possibly with a fondness for bamboo, in the manner of a giant panda. A 2019 study of ancient proteins preserved in the enamel of its teeth finally settled its family tree. Gigantopithecus was a relative of the modern orangutan, a colossal cousin of the gentle red apes of Borneo and Sumatra. And here is what makes it the perfect ending to this list. Gigantopithecus did not live in some remote age before humanity. It shared its forests with our own ancestors. Homo erectus, the upright, fire-using, tool-making human species that preceded us, lived in the same region at the same time. And at sites like a cave in Vietnam, their remains have been found in the same deposits. For a stretch of time, a 3-meter, quarter-ton ape and our own upright forebears walked the same forests, drank from the same rivers, and on occasion, almost certainly, saw one another across the trees. It is the most cinematic confrontation imaginable. Early humans face to face with a real-life giant ape. the very image that still fuels every Bigfoot and Yeti legend told today. And yet the truth, established by a major study published in 2024, is quieter and sadder than any monster movie. That study, which dated the ape's disappearance to somewhere between 295 and 215,000 years ago, found that Gigantopithecus was not driven to extinction by our ancestors at all. As the climate shifted and the dense forests it depended on broke apart into open savanna, the giant ape failed to adapt its diet. Its teeth from that final stretch show the marks of chronic stress and starvation. The largest primate that ever lived was simply too big, too specialized, and too slow to change, and it starved as its world dried out around it. The researchers found no sign that hominins had anything to do with it. Reconstructing a 3-meter ape from teeth and jawbones alone takes detective work, and the most important clue came in 2019. A team managed to extract ancient proteins from the enamel of a Gigantopithecus molar, nearly 2 million years old. And by reading the sequence of those proteins, they pinned down its family at last. Gigantopithecus was a pongene, a member of the orangutan branch of the great apes, which means the closest thing alive to this vanished giant is the quiet, red-haired ape swinging through the canopies of Borneo and Sumatra. The largest primate in history was, in essence, an orangutan scaled up to the size of a small bear. That orangutan connection is also the key to why it died and why its relatives did not. As the forests of southern China fractured into open grassland, the surviving orangutan lineage stayed flexible, shifting its range and its diet to cope. Gigantopithecus could not. Its sheer size locked it into needing vast quantities of food, and its teeth and gut were specialized for a narrow forest menu it could not abandon. When that menu shrank, the giant had nowhere to go. The 2024 study that dated its extinction read this failure directly from the teeth, in layers of stress and malnutrition laid down in the enamel of its final generations. It is a strange, quiet tragedy, an animal too big and too specialized to bend, starving in slow motion while its smaller cousin adapted and survived. So the deadliest face-off on this entire list, the giant ape against the first humans, is one that, as far as the evidence shows, never actually came to blows. Our ancestors did not slay the giant. They simply watched, from the edges of a changing forest, as the largest plant-eating primate in history quietly vanished, beaten not by a predator or a hunter, but by a few degrees of climate and a diet it could not give up. Finale. Look back at the 10, and a pattern emerges that runs against everything the word monster usually means. The most heavily armed animals in these ancient worlds were almost never the predators. They were the plant eaters. A rodent with a tiger's bite, a leaf eater with a gorilla's claws, a bird with a nutcracker that could crush a skull, a living tank swinging a spiked war club. Over and over, it was the vegetarians who wore the armor and carried the weapons, and the reason is simple and a little chilling. In nature, being prey is the most dangerous job there is, and evolution responds by turning the hunted into something the hunters cannot afford to touch. Notice, too, who actually did the killing whenever humans entered the story. Most of these giants never met a person at all. Their tusks and clubs and rams were forged in a much older war, against saber-tooths and terror birds, and the dangers of their own kind, never against us. And in the handful of cases where human and herbivore truly came face to face, the deadliest animal in the encounter was usually the one holding the spear. The giant moa did not wipe us out. We wiped it out in a century and a half. Even Gigantopithecus, the 3-meter ape that stood eye to eye with our ancestors, was undone not by human hands, but by a shrinking forest. That is the real lesson buried in these bones. The next time you imagine the most dangerous animal in a prehistoric landscape, do not look for the one with the longest fangs. Look for the one standing quietly in the grass, eating leaves, with a club for a tail, or a tiger's bite hidden behind those gentle jaws, and the calm of an animal that nothing else on Earth dared to challenge. The deadliest creatures of the ancient world were rarely the ones doing the hunting. They were the ones who had simply made themselves impossible to kill. And there is a final, sobering symmetry to it. Almost every one of these magnificently armored, superbly armed animals is gone. And hardly any of them were brought down by a bigger, fiercer beast. The giant rodent, the ram-nosed brontothere, the clawed browser, the nutcracker bird, the giant ape, all of them outlived their predators and then died anyway, undone by shifting climates and vanishing forests. The ones that made it into our era, the moa, the GLYPTODONT, the TOXODON, met a new kind of threat they had no defense against. A small, slow, clever animal that hunted in groups and carried sharpened stone. Being impossible for a predator to kill turned out to be no protection at all against a changing world, or against us. If this changed the way you see the gentle giants of the past, subscribe, because there are far more of these buried stories to dig up. And tell me in the comments, which of these 10 would you least want to corner in the wild? Until next time.